Sorry we had those technical difficulties. I was literally looking at my slides upstairs right before I came in, and we just had a hardware problem. But we're just going to use the backup and drive on, right? First of all, thank you for surviving the beginning of the last talk of the day. I really appreciate that. I'm John O'Keefe-Odom. I'm here from Chattanooga, and I'm here today to talk to you about evaluating injection attack tools through quasi-natural experimentation to inform risk assessments and policies. And that's quite a mouthful there, but really these are just three very simple ideas put together. First of all, I'm interested in evaluating injection and attack tools, particularly the automated ones. So we're just going to try to figure out what we can do to defend a system based on the behavior of the tools. I want to do this through quasi-natural experimentation. And quasi-natural experimentation may sound like black magic, but if you've had a statistics class anytime in the last 10 or 15 years, you were probably taught quasi-natural experimental techniques as part of the class, okay? And we're going to do this to inform risk assessments and policies. I'm a huge believer in risk assessments, and I know that there are probably a lot of folks who are working in environments where risk assessments are a check-the-block, unnecessary form that you have to fill out. And I hope to evangelize you a little bit and bring you a little closer to successful policy implementation. My main goal here is to try to drive home the answer to the question, when we're defending a system with very few resources, how do we know that our solution is going to work? I know many people who work in InfoSec work in large enterprise environments. I've worked in environments where there may just be one or two computer professionals on staff. And as a result of that, you're the only security people there. So I distinctly remember, and we'll see a case situation in our presentation today, where I remember defending a penetrated system, implementing what I thought was the correct solution, and I knew, okay, I want to do this, I want to do that, I want to do the other. And I did those things. And then I thought to myself, how do I know that any of this stuff just worked? And the truth was I didn't, right? If the attacker just stops attacking, if you were just a one-off hit on this guy's list, how do you know that your solution was going to work or not? Okay, I will tell you that in today's presentation, some of our ground rules are, I'm going to redact a lot of the information I show you. I'm going to try to present information that's based on real-world situations, but we're going to scrub some critical names and numbers so that we don't embarrass anybody. In the case of some of the photos, I've taken out some logos. In the case of other photos, I literally have blocked what I thought was critical information rather than show it to you. I usually break my talk down into four main sections here. First, we're going to go over a little vocabulary, because some folks are familiar or not familiar with risk assessments and policy. What I think makes them successful, I will tell you about this one situation that changed my career. And then, because I know a lot of security guys are just going to go comatose if you got to hear about another SQL injection attack, we're going to try to pick up these techniques and use them in other simulated situations that might be a little more interesting to you. All right, so let's go ahead and take off and get started. I want to go over a couple of these. These have been some of the main references for my research. If this is not familiar to you, please raise your hand. All right, have you all seen risk assessment matrices before? All right, I'd remind you that probability is graded along one axis and severity is graded along another axis. So hypothetically, you should be identifying what you believe are the potential vulnerabilities of your system, grading and evaluating them, and then following that up with some risk controls, and then reevaluating the residual risk. Okay. For our language about the threats, I picked OWASP automated threats. If y'all are not familiar with the OWASP automated threat handbook, I encourage you to have a look at it. The diagrams in there alone will make you smarter. They break down a lot of criminal-style operations, but they only focus on the automated threats in their handbook. And so I'm going to pick these up, and even when we go into the other situations, I'm going to try to carry over some of these definitions so you can see the analogies. in there. These are some of their standard threat descriptions. Of course, we're going to refer to NIST Special Publication 853, Revision 4. And this is so that we don't have to invent or make up our own risk controls. We're just going to go ahead and accept the standard ones that they provide. Now, if we go to their website, we go ahead and download a lengthy list of different types of risk controls available with some standard definitions there. I want to kind of emphasize here that when we have these situations where there is a standard list of threats and a standard list of controls, if we don't take the opportunity to extrapolate in both directions, this is not going to be very useful for your planning. Okay? If you want to make it a check-the-box form, just say, this threat, that control, we're going to move on. I don't know if you have seen Joe McRae's talk on SQL injection attacks I saw a video of him from a DEF CON presentation he did. And he described, of course, the tick mark 1=1 attacks, right? And if you've ever seen SQL injection, you've probably seen many rules written about this. And McRae's point was that if you wrote a lot of rules detecting tick mark 1=1, they work, right? They're logically sound. But all somebody has to do to circumvent those rules is to hit you with a 2=2 attack. Okay? All right? Right? So if you don't get to the heart of the threat, right? If you don't extrapolate a little bit, then you may not have a realistic interpretation of the threat, a realistic control implementation. And I want you to understand that that's going to be very important. It's going to be specific to your situation. That's the imagining and thinking you're going to have to do. As part of my research and work, I consulted these 4 documents quite a bit. Okay, so of course some NIST publications. Maybe hard for you to find now, but Journal of International Affairs Cyber Issue introduced me to the work of Herbert Lin and Benjamin Dean. Now, Benjamin Dean's one of our contemporaries, and what he did was he took some of these quasi-natural experimental design techniques and summarized them. And he's alive. I believe he's working in Indiana. And he summarized the work of the book on the right there, Experimental and Quasi-Experimental Designs by William Shadish. Now, Shadish died in 2016, but he spent an overwhelming majority of his career on experimental design. Now, Shadish was primarily working from the late 60s, mostly through the 70s and 80s, a little bit in the 90s, with a couple of contemporaries, but he wasn't studying cybersecurity. Shadish was studying education. And Shadish's fundamental problem was you can't teach somebody something the first time twice. Right? You only get one first time. So how do you know that that teaching technique worked? And it turns out that a lot of experimental design techniques that Shadish investigated are really applicable to internet network, because I think that most of the time we have attackers that are off premises. There's an internet between them and a target computer, so you'll never be able to really envelope the situation. We'll talk about some of their work. These are some of the situations I prepared. Based on our time, we might have to cut a couple of them. But what I'm going to try to do for you is to show a relationship between a given hazard, a given control, and an experimental design for some of these techniques, so that you can begin imagining yourself. How it is you're going to take these risk assessment techniques, have them stop being a piece of bureaucratic waste of your time, and start being an active part of your everyday planning. Okay, I am a web programmer. I use this photograph a lot because I used to be a black and white photographer for a little while. You might find me on Twitter. I am a graduate student at UT Chattanooga, and a lot of this work that we're presenting here today is part of my master's thesis research and work. I used to work with these guys. They were smarter than me, and that's why I was working with them. Okay, if you're working in a place where you're the smartest guy in the room, maybe you need to get another room. All right. I do make 100 mistakes a day as a web programmer, and there are probably 3 of them in this picture right here. I'm just glad I was wearing pants this time. Okay. When I say 100 mistakes a day, I mean 100 mistakes a day. Like, I've had bosses say, "Who made these 108 database errors on this one box?" And it was me, right? You know, if there were only 48, I knew I was falling behind today. And I really encourage you to go ahead and make a lot of mistakes. And don't be too ashamed about it, you know. If you're making your mistakes in development, that's where they need to be made in the first place, I think. I'm married to the beautiful and intelligent Mrs. O'Keefe Odom. She's seen here behind this taco menu. And I do have a little kitty cat, my cat. I enjoy some hacking stuff. This is a computer that recently submerged in some mineral oil. I do like to run and exercise quite a bit. I encourage you to do that. It helps me with stress. I like to drive my car, and I was in the Army for a while. And this is primarily where I learned how to work, and this is where I learned how to control risk, really. I was a competitive shooter for a while. If you do shoot, I encourage you to please be safe on the range. All right? Now, when I was a young 19-year-old recruit, or 17-year-old recruit, and I guess about the time this photo was taken, I was maybe 18, going on 19. At this time in our career, soldiers were just expected to work, okay? We were just expected to you just be tough and get through your job, okay? So I was jumping out of planes quite a bit, and I was operating radio systems that looked like this. And this was what we call RAT, Radio Automatic Teletype. This was an encrypted wireless form of networking over shortwave that mostly preceded the internet. If you're a ham radio operator, some of this may look familiar to you. Back then, we had to pass stress tests to lift the components. Like nowadays, people say, why do you even have a 15-pound lift requirement for your job? For this job, you had to be able to lift a 100-pound component 3 feet off the ground in order to install it in the rack. So I think that maybe they need to update today, right? I did learn the fundamentals of information security while I was there, okay? If you can get any information off a drive when I'm done with it, congratulations, you know. Maybe you need to do a master's thesis in electrical engineering. In this line of work, I learned a lot about information security. We were taught everything from one-time pads to generate your own electricity, construct your own antennas. You had to work the whole system soup to nuts. Just about every single time I hit the drop zone, somebody went home in an ambulance. Okay? And that was just expected. People were just expected to absorb risk. If you got hurt on the job, that was just too bad for you. After I was out of service for a while, I was out for over 10 years, and then in 2001, there was a large attack on New York City for September 11th. And so I went back into service, and I volunteered for a program in which workers were allowed to go into management, called OCS. And this particular program had a pretty high attrition rate, but we were taught the basics of planning and implementing different missions. And at this time, when I came back to the military, risk assessments were everywhere. I literally never saw a risk assessment when I was a enlisted soldier back in the late 80s, early 90s. But when I returned after September 11th, they were everywhere. If I was given this briefing in a military environment, I would be expected to conduct a risk assessment about this environment. You know, please don't fall asleep and fall out of your chair. Don't trip and fall over cords, stuff like that. But I basically was able, on a lot of my combat assignments as an officer, to be very successful and to go into a lot of extremely dangerous situations now and achieve victory. Now, you may look at me and recognize that I probably don't look like Rambo, right? Okay. And the reason why I was successful was because of planning and rehearsals. And this has really become a big part of my life to try to evangelize people about risk assessments. Now, when we look at cybersecurity or information security, NIST tells us, okay, these are our steps here. And if we look at them, you know, there are 3 of them in particular. 853 applies quite a bit: select, assess, and monitor controls. These steps of risk management framework are pretty much universal, but we can tie our references to those. Now, I'm going to tell you that in environments where I've seen risk assessments implemented successfully, most people have been in places where there was already a culture for a language of leadership that was there. Now, like if you're in a corporate environment and somebody tells you, what's our corporate mission statement? I hear just some of the most ridiculous platitudes I could have imagined, like, we want to be a better company, or we want to embrace humanity but be profitable, or just ridiculous meme-like things that you might see scrolling through social media. In the military, we did not do this. Okay? We had very concrete mission statements about who, what, when, where, why. And our plans were about how people did these things. And this language is very important to being successful because it allowed leaders to establish what a department was doing, and then, therefore, all subordinate ranks would be able to extract their own mission statements so that you could have a sum total. In other words, if you're in a low-ranking unit, the result of your contribution should be a clear, distinct block that contributes to a higher mission. We just don't see this in the workplace today. Okay? So if you're working in a workplace right now where they want you to just shut up and do your job today, and your tasking is just done through an email, then you might already be behind the 8 ball a little bit. Okay? But you need to bring this kind of concrete, task-oriented thought to your workplace in order to really have those risk assessments stand up and sing. Okay? Another thing I'd like to warn you about is, like, when I say rehearsals, for cybersecurity, most of the rehearsals are actually done through your testing. Okay? So that's really your only opportunity. If you don't set up some type of war gaming yourself, there may not be any testing done. And I will tell you that as a web developer, over 95% of testing I've seen done in a workplace has been done by the person who wrote the program. Okay? 95%, easy. The only times that I've really seen situations where programs where I felt properly tested were in places where I saw federally regulated workplaces. Like, if you had payment card information, or you had HIPAA requirements that need to be validated, for instance, maybe then you might have good testing. So you might need to actually put that seed in your employer's mind that, okay, you hired 2 programmers to write your programs at your company, but we're going to need you to hire somebody else who's outside of us to actually test this equipment. Test separately. If you're not having a separate person do the testing or do most of the testing, then really what you do is taking a convenience sample. Right? And I don't know how many times we've had mathematics professors tell us in statistics that convenience samples are basically just next to worthless. Okay? So if we're going to try to find testing results that are going to have some sort of scientific validity, we have got to get the developer out of the testing process and get testers that get respect in their companies. Now, if we just look at the pay scales, I don't know if anybody here is a professional tester or works in QA, but I'll tell you, as a web developer, I really perceive a pecking order in there, and I think that pecking order translates into pay. In other words, I feel like guys on QA who are testing are not getting paid equitably. Now, I attended a briefing earlier today that said a bug in a program could easily cost a corporation $1 million, and that the cheapest solution is for them to ship products that are stable and worthwhile. Well, isn't that worth paying the tester another 20%, another 25%? I think it probably is. We also do some acceptance testing and simplified unit testing. If you do testing, a lot of times what we're going to see is we're going to see people pen testing a program in a VM. And again, I really feel like this is just another form of convenience testing, just because of the people that are doing it. In other words, companies will oftentimes not spend on the testing. So now the testing is whatever you decided in your cubicle you could pull off on these machines that they gave you. And again, you're almost setting yourself up for failure there. Okay, so what are quasi-natural experiments? As I told you a moment ago about William Shadish and Benjamin Dean, we're going to have a look at some of their different design techniques. Now, when I saw Benjamin Dean's write-up in that journal article, one of the first things I said was, hey, is he right? We've got to go find out what Shadish did. So Dean summarized Shadish's work. Shadish's book that I read is about 800 some pages thick of different qualities of experimental testing, and really a lot of it is history and anecdotes of different types of tests that he did. But if we boil down his test techniques into a few different groups, we can see that there are really simple terms we use to describe these, right? First of all, I'd like for us to remember the kind of scientific experiment most of us think of, right? So like if you could imagine you're in chemistry class in 11th grade, you're doing a tabletop experiment about titration, you can measure something with litmus paper, whatever. A very simple tabletop experiment. We have a lot of control. So it's very easy for us to use a standard scientific method. Right? We can see all the components, we can measure everything, but let's notice that when we're doing network testing, we have that internet wedged in there. And so there'll be no way that we can control or accept all of the variables. So we turn to these things and say, okay, one technique is going to be one group post-test only. Okay, you're going to make one observation on groups of pre-tests. Or they say, well, we're going to have a group with a pre-test and a post-test. And this is pretty close to our traditional benchtop version. We say, okay, we do a pre-test, we do a post-test. After our treatment, we see what's going to happen. Post-test only for non-equivalent groups. You know, again, it's, we'll have one test with a post-test only. I'll be able to explain this. It gets a little bit better when we get on down the trail here. Repeated treatment. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and treat and treat and treat and treat and treat. Now, I would suggest that when I'm talking about treatment for network testing or for this type of testing, cybersecurity testing, our treatment is going to be whatever patch we put into place, whatever activity it is that you are doing to actually defend your system or your network. That's your treatment. If you're going to be reading the logs over and over again, that's your treatment. If you're going to run a program to go scan those logs over again, that's treatment. Okay? Difference in differences. And we'll talk about this one in a moment. And this is where we see two different groups. All right? We establish a control group, and we establish a treatment group, and we do tests before and after the treatment on one group. We have cohort control, where we have successive groups. This is very useful for people, and we have an interrupted time series. Okay, so let's talk a little bit how we're going to choose some of these techniques. Let's imagine that we're going to train a group of employees. I think a lot of times people will tell you, oh, you just need to train those users to make sure this problem doesn't ever happen again. Time and time again, we see this fails miserably. In fact, I would suggest it probably has one of the highest failure rate of a lot of treatment techniques that we apply. And so instead, a lot of our security personnel are going to say, well, I'm going to rely on a patch, I'm going to rely on a rule, I'm going to rely on an automated program. There's a much higher rate of success. So what we're talking about with cohort control is, let's imagine you work at a very big company. Of course, trying to teach everybody at the same time is unwieldy. So what are you going to do? You're going to teach them by department, teach them by section. Okay? Each one of those groups of people is a cohort. Now, let's suppose we want to ask ourselves, is our training of these cohorts going to be effective? So we train one group, and we train the second group. Now let's take the results of what happened with the second group and compare it to the first group. You tracking? And work our way through as many groups as we need in order to train the company as a scope. This next one will say, difference and differences. And I wanted to talk about this one for a moment because if we think back to our tabletop experiment, difference and differences might sound like it doesn't make any sense. So let's say we're going to take two groups and we're going to split them in half. So if you could imagine, let's say you have one environment that mimics an active system. And we have another copy of that environment. So now we have two groups that we're going to treat. To the treatment group, we choose to go ahead and apply our patch. Okay? So when we create these two environments, we conduct a pretest for both of them. Then we apply our treatment, and then we conduct a post-test to both of them. Well, it seems to make sense over here on the treatment group. That's kind of what we would expect, right? We do a pre-test, a treatment, and a post-test. Why are we testing the control group twice? It kind of doesn't make any sense, right? All right, if we think about our little tabletop experiment, our control group, by definition, is a group that has nothing happen to it. So if we didn't do anything, it ought to be just fine, right? Exactly. Testing the test or testing other conditions that may be contributing to the environment. Because let's keep in mind now, when we're actually doing our test and we're going to, let's say, have a red team attack this group that we're treating. Now, if we pre-test on both sides and we post-test on both sides and we have an internet involved in that environment, okay, let's suppose that our treatment group all of a sudden turns out to be something that says, oh, that treatment group, there's a lot of latency after the treatment, and we didn't test our control group. You see what I'm saying? We might accidentally reach for qualities about the treatment which might actually be confounded with the environment or the test construction itself. Okay. When we talk about testing, a lot of times the rigs get our attention. We think about the VMs, the attack pattern, the cool toys we're going to play with. And I applaud the cool toys, of course. But really, it's about the test. It's about our thinking, right? If we have poor tools but good thinking, we're going to have something that's going to be more reportable and more actionable. If you do a lot of tests in VMs, I'd encourage you to look up this academic paper. I stumbled across it. It was written by some guys in Kentucky, Galloway, and I can't remember this other, Shinanish, from Western Kentucky University. These guys presented at IEEE. And the brunt of their findings was they took 3 very commonplace VM hypervisors and they subjected them all to DDoS attacks. And unfortunately, my favorite one performed miserably. Okay, VirtualBox just crumbled. But I think ESXi was doing very well. I encourage you to have that look at that if you do testing that. All right, so now I'd like to go ahead and move to attack topology. This was the attack that changed my career as a web programmer. I had a client who all of a sudden had a pawned production box. And they found out the box was pawned because all of a sudden massive amount of directory just disappeared. Okay, it's like they're looking at the website, all of a sudden it was gone. And sysadmin logged in and a huge block of files were gone. So we just saw directory destruction, went to have a look at some of the logs, and of course we saw a lot of evidence of SQL injection attacks. For those of you who are not familiar with injection attacks, we saw logic attacks, we saw union cache poisoning, saw a numerical overflow, but I want to point out that in real life, these attacks don't occur individually. I would see one line of code that crams all those concepts into it. And so it would be like 250 lines of code cramming all those ideas into one. You all follow me? Okay. So a bulk of complex attacks there. A lot of SQL map defaults. My skitty friends, we can identify your SQL map attack just by the shape of the SQL code that is output in the logs, and oftentimes there will actually be a little trailer there in the browser identification. We found a lot of BitTorrent botnets and individuals attacking us. Okay, so basically what would occur is when people would attack, we'd look them up in Shodan, and Shodan of course would tell us, hey, this IP is a part of a BitTorrent botnet, and this would explain a lot of their attacking. So a lot of curl recon attacks, which seem to be similar to a local APT, recently released APT, in which ubiquity internet devices and MikroTik test servers were being compromised in South America. And what these devices had in common was that they had board manufactured in Latvia. So I believe what was happening was one of the more sophisticated attackers was compromising those boxes, hitting the site one time, just to see if it was there, and if it would respond, then it would go ahead and count it as a successful recon. So we get about 70 of those a day. And then, of course, the usual vulnerability scanners like Acunetics scans, and, of course, direct intrusion evidence. Well, it shocked everybody when this happened. And so with being only a couple people on staff at that client's place, we needed to get smart fast. So one of the first things I did was come down here and started traveling to a lot of BSides conventions, and as many places I go, do as much reading as possible because we had to get smart ourselves. They were not going to hire somebody who already knew about these topics, and what limited academic exposure I had to it was not good enough to really match these sophisticated and bulk attacks that were occurring against that particular box. So this is the attacker's goal on that prod box, was they wanted to basically establish a carding site in order to support prostitution activities. They had a couple of other activities, but basically they wanted to be able to rip off people's credit cards. Okay. So most of the BSides topics were about sex. Okay. So no matter who you are, if these people had somebody who might be remotely attracted to you, All right, if you were remotely attractive, you had commercial currency in their sites. They appealed to a wide range of sexual orientations and countries and combinations of people. They also did a lot of online banking and payments in that they wanted to mimic a lot of those sites. We saw some also wanted to go to sites where people would bid on expensive cars, okay, and maternity clothes. I thought it was kind of an odd combination, but really was anything people would spend a lot of money on at one point in their lives. So using these particular sites, now when they're using these particular sites, it would attract victims. Now I assure you that the attacker did his own risk assessment, because built into his site that he was using, they would deploy extensive blacklists inside those directories. So I see .htaccess files would go on for 2,000 lines of Perl script, naming individual IPs that this criminal did not want on the site. And he would have comments in there about who he didn't want and why he didn't want them. So if you work for a big corporation, like let's say Google or Microsoft or someplace that had established security teams, they would just try to block you out and enforce, and then they would start listing individuals after that, including other criminals, right? He didn't want his competition seeing what's happening on the site. There was one person who had apparently been a real jerk to my attacker, and he didn't want to do business with him anymore, and he was in the blacklist also. So they also had segregation of duties and separation stuff. So as we talk about the topology here in a minute, you're going to see that the attacker makes sure he keeps his business to himself, and he doesn't really involve his customers very much. And some premium fraud features built into these sites. I mean, when you went to this attacker's site, and it was an online banking site. It was an exact copy of the real online banking site, in terms, graphically speaking. Oftentimes they would fake a page with a single page application. Y'all familiar with SPAs? These are really or Angular. Okay, that was my introduction to SPAs. Was the attacker would basically put a picture of a real site, place his own HTML over it through JavaScript, and then they would fake page loading. Right? Because you got that big funky URL that doesn't actually match at the top of the address bar. So what he would do is he would fake the page loading that would be expected by the user, even though he was running a single page application. Look very much like the actual ones like these over here. So if you can imagine somebody's going to ask you to reset your password. I remember looking at some of the source code for this, and there would be slight deviations in there, like after the person had given up all their information, they would be told, it's going to be about 48 hours before your changes take effect, Yeah, it's going to be 48 hours before some changes take effect, right? Okay, well, so let's figure out how these guys fight. Some of my friends, I got some photo album snapshots in there. They're basically 4 lanes of activity in this ploy over here. We have an attacker, what a guy I call a renter, and then a victim, and then, of course, our bait site. So our attacker would conduct a SQL injection attack. He'd basically gain access to the prod box. We know that because he bragged about it publicly later. And he'd unpack a calling card, which is literally a big sign that says, "Here I am, this is me, it's my hacker name, all my buddies who want to check me out, see me here on this site." He unpacked a Trojan, all right, because he wanted to be able to come back. He started unpacking templated sites. And he picked a pretty good directory to unpack all this stuff in. It took me a long, long time to find it. And they recruit renters, right? So criminals that actually want to conduct business with somebody who knows how to run a carding site, they would contact them, he would recruit them, and he'd establish a business relationship with them. So what the attacker would do is he'd take his template site, he'd pick another directory on the box, he'd clone his template site there, he'd give the renter information for just contacting that one site that he had cloned. And some of these would be stylized or customized to varying degrees. I think if my attacker had various service packages that he was offering to his clients, and it looked like at least one time somebody bought the cheap package and they were going to customize it themselves. They're doing a really, really poor job of that, okay? I guess if you're going to purchase, criminal technical expertise, you should probably pick the gold package, right? Of course, they wanted to use a prostitution catalog site as bait, so victims would be routed to the carding site. Okay, so your renter, I believe, would probably be more in line with lining up to prostitutes. And oftentimes we would see the prostitutes on websites like this and just be XXX, some female's name, .ru. And then there would be basically a listing of how much that person's services will cost. Okay? So you would imply that, all right, if they go ahead and they buy these things, then this is how much it's going to cost you. And so the most expensive service on this list are translated from rubles to dollars to about $30 a night. Okay? So we start to have some questions, right? Who is the victim here, right? I kind of wonder if some of these people who are involved right here aren't victims. But the goal is to get the person to the carding site. And that's what they did. Now, I believe when the victim went searching for those services, they were already basically poisoned in their search with cross-site scripting. And we could tell by the reference sites that they're already carrying payloads from Yandex.ru, which is similar to Google. So I think that when they began their searches, they were already looking for these kind of topics. They were already going to be routed to probably customized search results that were going to bring them right over to these carding sites. Okay, so now if it gets compromised or deleted, because every so often I find one, right? What do? He just unpack another one, right? And place it someplace else. Now, if you can imagine this type of operation occurring at scale, right? So not only is they're compromising this one particular box, but I believe because of the periodicity that these people were compromising many, one after another, after another, after another. All right, so here it is. This is the Trojan that caused me so much trouble. This is a PHP cryptic Trojan. And I don't know if you can see the photograph very well, but I assure you that above the red line in this picture is basically an elaborate array. And below that line is a base 64, probably multiple layers. I never have managed to successfully decode it. Cryptic Trojan, right? Virus Total tells us exactly what this is. And what they had done was, I had buried this in a junk-filled directory, and so that's how we end up being victimized. All right, so let's move on to some attack situations and some risk controls for experimental design. For the sake of time, I want to jump over this particular one. All right, I will tell you, though, that what I recommend in this case are daily log reviews of public-facing web applications. And I imagine that many people here work in the enterprise level security jobs. Can you show of hands, please? You guys work in enterprise? All right. You probably absolutely hate the concept that I just told you to go read those logs. And considering the massive quantity of logs that you guys face, you have my sympathies. In this particular instance, what we had was a contractor who had set things up and not revealed all the information to the business owner. So logs were not readily available. It actually took months to extract, get enough control over the site itself in order to be able to get a hold of these logs. But looking at these logs, right, daily log reviews, this is an example of our interrupted time series that we talked about earlier. So every time that you're looking at a log, that is another treatment. That's another opportunity for detection. One treatment group, your one prod site with many observations before and after. That's your log review in action. I found this particular Trojan on line 178,596 of the log that I reviewed. So it was buried down in there pretty deep. And as you can see, this was basically our first indication that there was such trouble there. And of course, they were getting referred over from a Yandex search. So this part that I've covered up in here, this was a specific directory that linked them back to a targeted site. And then, so from there, I was able to trace them back down to the templated site. All right, so normally you would conduct an initial risk assessment. You go ahead and begin to implement your controls for code injection. And in this case, we're going to use, if we use log reviews, we just do an interrupted time series. And then we would, again, conduct another risk assessment. I want to point out to you that, okay, when this happened to me, this was one of my best days on my job when I found that cryptic Trojan. Right? As a programmer, I don't normally encounter security problems. This was fantastic to me. I thought everybody would be happy about it, but I'm going to tell you that part of my philosophy is that bad things happen to good people who do the right thing every day. Okay? I definitely learned that in combat. Right? Some people who think that, oh, if you do right and you work right, everything's going to go right for you and you should have a good life. And we see a lot of interruptions of those sequences in our lives. And this type of situation really caused me to focus on our perceptions of actor and victim responsibility. You know, if we think back to some of the workers who advertise in those catalogs, are they actors, are they victims, or both? And where do we stand in all this? Right? This is just part of the environmental hazard of working inside a very aggressive environment, which is the internet. Now, this is what I got for my trouble. Okay, I was at work one day. I go out to my car to go to lunch, and somebody cut the battery cable in my car. All right, and this was just one of many incidents that I encountered in the workplace. And part of what was happening was when I discovered this problem, and I thought everybody would be glad about it, it turned out that it actually began to reveal business problems with the disposition of and use of equipment in a company. And so then people were angry. Right? So they wanted to suppress reporting. They wanted to apply social pressure to me to try to get me to leave. Okay? And this is the prior thing I mentioned. I mentioned this because when I hear things like people say, well, folks are socially pressured in InfoSec because of this, or we have a very nasty culture, this is pretty much what I think of. Okay? I think somebody picked up this stick in the parking lot and manufactured this little tool. They jimmied their way in my car, and then they cut that battery cable. I ended up leaving that job some months later. Okay, this is now my favorite issue of Harvard Business Review: How to Work with Toxic Colleagues. And I will tell you that at the time I was studying things like, well, what do we do about psychopathic or narcissistic people in our workplace? And there does come a point in these really bad, aggressive, abusive relationships where you might just have to say, okay, I got to leave. You might not be able to change those people. All right, so I did end up finding my brothers at DC 423. And one of the things that I learned, if there are any students here, one of the things I learned about these kind of activities is that this is almost a rite of passage. Almost to a person, a lot of the programmers and hackers that I respected had a significantly negative social experience at some point in their career. Okay? If it hasn't happened to you yet, maybe you're just on the waiting list. Okay? It may not be as blatant as some of the things that I encountered, but it's a lot of times it can be quite severe. So what I ended up having to do is I just channeled all this into my research at the university. I still consider myself a very lucky individual. Okay, I started working on my master's thesis on this topic, and now, given our time, I'd like to go ahead and jump into some of these other attack situations, so we don't just have to talk about code injection. Okay. We can talk about RFID cloning and mechanical lockpicking. And as many of you know, our great state of Tennessee has some of the most interesting laws about lockpicking in the United States. Okay, seems quite interesting. I personally suspect, but do not know, that hey, somebody wanted to write some industry protections into these rules, and now that they've created something that's quite aggressive about lockpicking. So as a Tennessee resident, of course, I would not own any of these locks, these lock picks, and I wouldn't practice regularly. Okay? But if you did, you might learn a thing or two about physical security. Are you all familiar with this device that I'm showing here on the picture? This is a Proxmark 3 RDV. And for those of you who may not be familiar with this, this is basically a handheld cloning device that's used for replicating RFID cards. And if you work in a corporate environment, you probably have just such a key card to let you in almost every door every day. This device is pretty much a handheld computer. All you got to do is attach a battery, and you can go ahead and start replicating cards with it. I didn't have to replicate cards. This is one place I showed up. Okay, it was a little cold, rainy outside, and so I was tapping on the door with my key. Okay, and I was at a major federal contractor's office. All right, tapping on the door with my key, and an employee was inside. Said, "Oh, you're here? Here, let me in. Let me let you in." They literally just opened the door and let me into the facility. They didn't check my ID or anything. I walk up to the receptionist desk. I get to the receptionist desk, the employee says to me, hey, here you go, here's the book. Pushes the book at me across the table. Sign yourself in. Opens the book to the last page. And he shows me, here's your card. Hands me this card. And as you can see, it says, visitor, no escort required. So just gives me the key to walk all around the building. And then says to me, certain numbers on this card are important, and certain numbers on this card are not important. Well, I blanked out the numbers that were important in this picture. Okay, so you can guess how many digits were not important. And he explained to me that they were or were not important to their internal security procedures. He told me what to write down in the law there. Okay? All right, so they just pretty much handed me the whole thing. So I put on my badge, okay, and I started walking around. Nobody had gotten there yet, so I found these SSIDs and passwords written on the walls. You often do in a lot of corporate environments. So I will start logging in, checking out what's available on the network. And I had drained my coffee cup, so I was walking around with an empty coffee cup. And come across another employee, the employee who let me sign myself in. He disappeared, left me alone at the receptionist desk with a turned-on computer. Oh, you know, some of that was like, let's just say the entire thing was very challenging in my professional ethics. Right? So I had this empty coffee cup. I was wandering around. Another employee said, oh, the coffee service is not here yet. Let me get you a cup of coffee myself. Right? So one scurries back to his desk and gets me something out of his private stash. Okay? So based on this incident, right? We didn't even have to pick any locks. I'll tell you that, you know, if somebody was attempting to intrude physically on your facility, of course, we might see some parallels to these OWASP automated threats, right? Particularly footprinting, right? And scalping and vulnerability scanning. And this is, of course, a credential cracking and account aggregation. So if you're cloning those cards, you are basically creating another account. You're going to want to do some footprinting because once you get inside, you're going to want to know what it is you can do while you're there. Okay, and I'd say it will count as scalping because you're attempting to obtain something of value. Conduct a risk assessment over here, and then let's say we're going to go ahead and implement some of these controls. And then out of this control list, I think we ought to go ahead and select visitor control. Okay, so this gets us back to our employees trained to interact with strangers in the workplace or not, right? So we might have cohort control, right, or we might have case control experimental designs. I would go ahead and conduct another risk assessment to evaluate the residual risk. And these would be the hazards, controls, and designs that we just mentioned. I hope you guys come out a little wiser. Let's see here. Based on time, I'd like to go ahead and skip over LAN wiretaps and go into Wi-Fi replays and frame injection. Now, Wi-Fi is used quite a bit in workplace. And I would suggest that most corporate Wi-Fi networks are reasonably secure. I don't know if y'all have seen this issue of 2600. Y'all have a look at that at all? There's an article in there about one page about go ahead and build your own pineapple poly. All right, so I go ahead and decided to try it. They wanted to go ahead and build one for $20. You had to use an adapter and a Raspberry Pi and see if you can build yourself a pineapple. So I put one together, and this is what mine looks like. Okay. So go ahead and I put it in a binder. Thanks to a suggestion from Brent White that I saw over here at a different BSides Nashville. Putting things in common office supplies allows you to carry around the environment. What this does is it basically conducts monitoring so that you can go ahead and do man-in-the-middle attacks. Right? If you use Aircrack Suite or Aeromon, this is a hobbyist version of HackFi's premier pineapple. So our OWASP automated threats, again, would have to do with account aggregation, credential cracking, fingerprinting, footprinting, and vuln scanning. This script that I wrote, basically that's all it did was conduct vulnerability scans, right? So I took you have to have enough initiative of imagination to take the references that you receive and extrapolate them, right? So when we're looking at the advice or the user docs for Airmon or Aircrack, it doesn't really tell us how to build a good offensive attack tool, right? They probably have some liability concerns there, I'm sure. So we need to extrapolate. So I was thinking of things like, okay, if I'm going to use this, I'm going to want to delay. So I'm going to build a delay into my script before my stuff starts. When I start scanning, let's say I might not know that I'm in the correct target area at a given time, so perhaps I need to do multiple scans for a limited time. In other words, what I'm suggesting is if you start researching this type of thing, that you start reaching out. Don't just accept what the standard controlled references tell you. All right, so for Wi-Fi replays and injection, we'd ask, okay, where is the person most vulnerable? And I would suggest that we see some different standards in some companies, and I know I have seen, and particularly in private companies, where you have executive privilege on some things, right? Like I've had a president of a company show me a nice pornographic joke on his business email that he's keeping on his personal phone, okay? Right? So what did I see there? I saw vulnerability. Okay? I saw a lot of vulnerability. I wasn't as concerned about the joke or the topic as the vulnerability. So I would suggest that if you have people inside your organization, that really the vulnerability might not be in the workplace. It might be when they're picking up these BYOD devices and moving outside of your boundary control, right? Because when you're establishing Wi-Fi controls, you're using that boundary control, risk control that NIST 853 tells you about. But when they get home, it's not there anymore. So there's your place for doing the war dialing and for doing the interception. It's not going to be inside your building as much as it might be across the street in your house. Okay? All right, so you would need to conduct Wi-Fi training, prepare your employees. Okay, so you're probably already preparing them a little bit. I would guess that most people require VPNs in order to go ahead and contact your company. But so I would suggest in these cases we're talking about designs without control groups, right? One group and post-test only. In other words, when you test a group of employees, you're probably going to test them afterwards. You're probably not going to bother with testing their performance before, because until they actually get the tools and they receive the basic instruction, it doesn't make sense to conduct a pretest. But just because you're in that limited situation doesn't mean that you can't conduct legitimate tests. Okay. Let's go into phishing campaigns just briefly. Of course, we're not talking about this kind of phishing. A friend of mine from Las Vegas, this was the first fish he ever caught in his entire life, was a 22-inch snapper there. This was phishing, of course, campaigns. They're always dependent upon the attractiveness of the bait. And this is one that I got the other day. So would you like a nice, attractive job in cybersecurity? All you got to do is agree to receive this router at your house, right? Receive this router and take that shipping label off and put this other shipping label on and send it out. And it's the same old dropship mail fraud forwarding scheme that we're all familiar with, right? But see how it's customized to what we would want, right? That's the same thing that's happening, of course, to all of our users. They just want to tell you what you want to hear while doing what they want done, right? And we tell these users, do not click on those attachments that might be loaded with, come in a phishing email, and they do it anyway because it's their nature, right? So we may experience some momentary disappointment, right? And really our best reliance is a good set of backups, right? I don't know how many times we've seen ransomware get unloaded on customer service reps, and really containment and backups were our key protections. I would tell you that my most practical advice for the situation in small companies is tell people to stop typing. Stop typing. Stop typing. Don't click on anything. Just go ahead and call your IT department. Go ahead and call us. And if you're a management in a company, I would encourage you, please do not penalize employees who report the fact that they are a victim of some sort of ransomware. I know I've seen situations where, okay, the employee's computer is no longer usable today, therefore you're going home today. And if you're an hourly employee, I just penalize you some valuable money by doing that. Okay? But please think ahead. Now, when we're going into training folks about stuff like this, you might see a design with a control group, but no pretest, right? Post-test only for non-equivalent groups. And with that, I would like to go ahead. I'm probably going to close here in a moment, but I did want to show you at least one or two of these slides here. We've all seen passwords underneath the keyboard someplace. This behind the screwdriver handle is not somebody's password. It's not their employee ID. It was the algorithm to compute an employee ID from publicly available information. Okay? So if you gave me a cup of coffee and you had me wandering around your business and I stumbled upon this little Post-it note right here, imagine how much more damaging things could be, right? I also want to advise you this CWE is as a programmer, we rely on CWEs a lot. Hey, insufficient psychological acceptability. If you make your risk control so tough that your users can't understand it, then you just basically created another vulnerability in your system. All right, here, I'm going to go ahead and catch up here. All right, guys, I did not get to cover absolutely everything that I wanted to do today. But I will tell you, this is me on my helicopter today, about to leave, get on a helicopter about 10 years ago. I'm a very happy man right there. We did have a chance to talk about some of these concepts here. We're talking about NIST 853 controls. We did talk about some of our main references. We did have an opportunity to look at attack topology. I hope I told you enough about some real-world situations so that you can understand what it is that you're defending against every day, or what may be out there waiting for you in a dangerous world. And we did have an opportunity to discuss some of these other situations here. I guess I'll go ahead and open for questions if you guys have any questions. I see that there are no questions, and pretty soon it'll be time for us to go to closing ceremonies. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you here today.